Welcome and thank you for your interest in our paper. My name is Eugénia da Conceição-Heldt from the Department of Governance at the Technical University of Munich. I'm here to introduce you to the paper published jointly with Thomas Dörfler from the University of Potsdam. Our article, entitled Orchestrating Private Investors for Development, How the World Bank Revitalizes, has just been published online and open access at Regulation and Governance. Before I briefly present the content of the paper, let me just say a few words on the context in which this paper has been written. Basically, this paper is part of two broader research projects here at the Chair of European and Global Governance at the Technical University of Munich. One project is about the empowerment of international organizations founded from the European Research Council. And the second project is on international bureaucracies as runaway agents. And it specifically deals with the question on how organizational structure affects agency slack. And this project is financed by the German Research Foundation, the DFG. In a nutshell, both projects focus on the consequences of delegating power to international organizations. One of these research areas is on how resource constraints can lead to different adaptation strategies by international organizations with the aim of revitalizing themselves. In the next step, I'm going to present you the argument of the paper, its empirics, and some of the central findings. But let me just start by saying a few words on how this happened. Confronted with a new wave of criticism, in particular from its largest shareholder, the US, on the ineffectiveness of the World Bank's development programs, President Jim Yong-kim announced in January 2018 a plan to revitalize the bank by turning to private investors to finance the International Development Association, IDA, projects, and by expanding the scope of the bank's mandate to encompass climate change, gender aspects, and global health. The shift towards private investors, including sovereign wealth funds, private equity, and insurance companies, marks a new development in revitalizing IDA, which has so far been based on traditional donor replenishment funding model. And as the most of you know, IDA is one of the 5 World Bank Group institutions. To explain how the bank responds to changes in the environment, we draw on organizational ecology and orchestration scholarship. Basically, we contend that international organizations rely on 2 adaptation mechanisms, orchestration and scope expansion, when they lose their role as focal actors in an issue area. We find that the World Bank has indeed lost market share and has relied on these 2 mechanisms to revitalize itself. We show that the World Bank responded to changes in the environment by orchestrating a private sector-oriented capital increase, prioritizing private funding for development through a cascade approach, and by expanding the scope of its mandate into adjacent domains of transnational governance, including climate change and global health. Our study shows how the World Bank has operated in a space increasingly populated by private financial flows to developing countries. We demonstrate that the bank has been struggling to maintain its focality in multilateral development finance due to the entry into scene of new competitors, namely the creation of the new development bank, NDB, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, together with the World Bank's loss of market share in the multilateral development assistance landscape. Our study contributes to the literature in 4 ways. First, we bring together the debates on private actors in global governance and the literature on orchestration. By doing so, we study the complex environment of multilateral development institutions and how they enlist private actors to obtain access to economic resources they cannot otherwise acquire. Second, we contribute to the debate on IO resourcing. Whilst this literature has begun to investigate donor and corporate influence, donor funding choices, or IO funding rules, we draw attention to broader developments in the organizational environment tied to the specific adaptation mechanisms of global economic institutions. Third, we contribute to the literature on the World Bank's role vis-à-vis non-state actors. We investigate how maintaining focality as a development financier plays a key role in IO adaptation by enlisting private actors. Finally, in this paper, we draw on World Bank documents, including strategy documents, annual reports, evaluation reports, financial statements, and trust fund reports, together with press coverage and secondary sources, to examine the bank's adaptation strategies in terms of crowding in private capital and expanding its scope. In a nutshell, we argue that IOs will orchestrate private actors and expand into adjacent domains to revitalize themselves in densely populated spaces. With regard to orchestration, the evidence suggests, first, that IOs will seek to acquire resources adequate to achieving their goals. Second, that if IOs cannot obtain these resources from member states, they will orchestrate private actors to fill the resource gap. And third, that IOs will adopt specific programs to attract and bind private capital. As regards scope expansion, the observable evidence suggests that, first, IOs will seek to expand their scope to acquire additional resources into adjacent domains. Second, IOs will frame an adjacent issue as critical to achieving their core mission. And third, IOs will adopt specific programs to implement scope expansion. Let me now turn to the empirical part of our paper, in which we trace how the World Bank has reacted to the loss of market share. As I mentioned earlier, the first reason for the real decline in the bank's market share is closely linked with the creation of new multilateral development banks, MDBs, including the New Development Bank and the AIIB under Chinese leadership from 2016 on. These two new MDBs now compete with IDA with their focus on financing infrastructure development projects. Like IDA, AIIB approved projects include not only classical infrastructure projects, but also address broader issues of human development. Thus, the development assistance market is now crowded with a multitude of MDBs competing for market shares in the same areas. However, in contrast to IDA, NDB and AIIB finance development programs almost without conditionality. The second reason for the decline in the bank's market share has to do with the substantial increase in external financial flows to developing countries in terms of foreign direct investment, remittances, and philanthropy since the turn of the millennium. Just to briefly give you a few numbers, while bilateral and multilateral financing made up 27% of movements to developing countries in 2002, this share fell to 14% 10 years later. In 2016, private flows at market rate and remittances dwarfed bilateral and multilateral flows. Moreover, philanthropy has become a growing source of development finance, expanding to about $40 billion in 2014. While different types of financial flows affect World Bank influence differently, as remittances do not go towards building hospitals in developing countries, they are likely to affect the demand for borrowing. World Bank Group institutions committed around $62 billion in loans and investments in 2017, while other investors now inject more than $1 trillion a year into emerging markets. These numbers make clear that the World Bank operates in an external environment characterized by an enormous demand for development financing and surging private sources of development financing. In this new environment, the bank's market share has declined and public funding is unlikely to close the gap. Turning to private capital funding is a way to revitalize the bank in a new environment populated by diverse competitors. In April 2015, the bank launched the From Billions to Trillions report, together with 5 MDBs and the IMF, suggesting a new approach to financing development programs. This approach aimed to increase funding to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by recurring to private capital. Based on this report, the bank adopted its formal forward-look strategy in 2016, officially postulating the mobilization of private capital as one of its key priorities also for IDA. The bank intended to cooperate with institutional investors, including pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds. 1 year later, the World Bank, together with other MDBs, committed itself to increasing overall private sector mobilization by 25 to 35% over the following 3 years. I will now turn to the specific measures that the bank has taken to orchestrate private investors. The first measure consisted in leveraging IDA for private capital. Having proved that financing instead of grants could partially fund IDA, the bank proposed to directly access private funding during IDA 18 by reintroducing the idea of bringing IDA to the capital market by issuing IDA bonds. The second revitalization measure of the bank consisted in securing the support of the Board of Governors for a sizable capital increase for both the IBIRD and IFC in 2018 to orchestrate private capital and tied to more stringent mobilization targets. The third avenue to revitalizing the bank to counter the decline in market share was to mobilize private capital in a so-called cascade approach aimed at attracting private investors via new financial instruments. In 2015, the G20 had urged MDBs to focus on leveraging accumulated equity and on risk sharing with private investors. This initiative was in response to the realization of G20 governments that public funding was insufficient to cover all their financing needs, thus opening the door to the private sector. With the introduction of this approach, the bank shifted its lending approach to leveraging the private sector for growth and sustainable development. Essentially, the cascade approach commits banks' operations to prioritizing private funding and lowering dependence on donor largesse. Overall, one can say that the cascade approach marks an extremely profound shift in the lending approach and makes private financing the default option, supported by de-risking initiatives, with public funding only being a last resort. The bank's strategy coincides with a broader global shift in development discourse, which stands for public-private partnerships in global economic institutions to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. The bank's design of new strategies to escort private capital to development asset classes in the Global South was aligned with the G20 position on turning development into investable projects that can be financed via bond markets. At the heart of this initiative, as a major instrument for leveraging the bank's balance sheet, is securitization, which reflects a competitive response to the growing use of these markets by China-led MDBs. Securitization is the process of taking such loans, equity, and guarantees and transforming them into tradable asset-backed securities. These securities can then be used as collateral for new loans. The risk can also be shared and tailored to private sector investors with different risk profiles, so that MDBs require fewer reserves, which again maximizes lending space. The core idea is that these initiatives will create revenue used to repay MDBs ahead of schedule, which allows additional MDB loans to be made into developing countries. The second adaptation strategy of the bank for coping with its declining market share consisted in expanding its portfolio to global public goods. To justify this scope expansion, the bank adopted a narrative of aligning its goals with broader sustainable development goals, ranging from poverty, health, education, gender, water and sanitation, environment, climate change, peace, and security. With this scope expansion, the bank also widened the concept of development. The bank's twin substantive goals of ending extreme poverty by 2013 and boosting shared prosperity for the bottom 40% in developing countries largely coincide with the Sustainable Development Goals. The bank strategically portrayed unaddressed global public goods as a threat to its core mission of ending extreme poverty. For example, the bank linked climate change to development and development to global pandemic issues. Widening the scope of its mandate to include these new global challenges was crucial for the bank in seeking to obtain public and private capital funding. The bank has strategically adopted the narrative that the fulfillment of its core mission required new issues listed in the Sustainable Development Goals to be addressed, such as climate change, health, displacement, and gender issues. To achieve this, the bank promised institutional investors market opportunities in these sectors. Thus, one can say that the bank accelerated the Washington Consensus push for the privatization and commodification of public goods. A scope expansion into global public goods was linked to two substantial institutional innovations: public-private partnerships and financial intermediary funds. Expansion of the World Bank's mandate through financial intermediary funds has predominantly taken place in climate change and health, which amount to about 85% of total five funding. The three largest financial intermediary fundings, all in the domain of climate change, are the Global Environment Facility, the Climate Investment Fund, and the Green Climate Fund. In the domain of health, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria is the largest financial intermediary fund, followed by the Pandemic Emergency Facility created in response to the Ebola crisis. Displacement and gender issues mark also two ecological niches for the World Bank mandate expansion with less funding volume. You will find more detailed information on how these financial intermediary funds work in our paper. Let me just finish by summarizing the main findings of the paper, and also to briefly enumerate some of the consequences. So what we see is that basically in recent years, the funding of global development programs has shifted towards private capital mobilization. This financial revolution has important consequences for MDBs, for competition among actors and financing forms. As in other policy areas, dependence on private capital funding is on the rise, with implications for the future of global development governance. Why is this the case? Private investors are likely to set different priorities than state actors and will ensure high returns on their investment in development financing. To explain this shift toward private capital, we have focused on the revitalization of the World Bank to explain the conditions under which IOs engage in raising private capital funding and expanding their scope to close the gap opened by a decline in market share. In the paper, we basically argue that orchestration of private financing and scope expansion are rational responses to resourcing challenges. Our first proposition was that when IO's market share declines, IOs are more likely to look for complementary private funding to attain the necessary resources. Our case study shows that the bank has adapted with a mix of transforming the International Development Association to borrow sizable private capital, gaining support from member states for a capital increase for the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the International Finance Corporation, designed for additional private capital mobilization, and setting up novel development financing instruments for crowding in private investors throughout the bank. Our second proposition was that when the market share of an IO declines, the IO is more likely to expand its mandate into adjacent domains to attain resources. Our case study illustrates that the bank aligned its mandate strategically with the broader sustainable development goals to increase its market share through public-private partnerships and financial intermediary funds in these fields. While orchestration and scope expansion are two distinct responses, in our case study, both co-occur as simultaneous responses to declining market share. What are the consequences of the World Bank's shift to crowd-in private financing? First, the bank's strategy to increase private capital for the International Finance Corporation and the International Development Association has legitimized the notion that private finance is the solution to pressing development. Second, alongside borrowers and donors, private investors join the group of stakeholders, becoming additional principals with their own agendas and will probably affect the bank's lending strategies. Of course, it's too early to speculate whether these changes will shape the existing accountability at the bank or even lead to new ones. Third, privatizing development financing also seems to have human rights implications. Greater reliance on private financing could therefore lead to less human rights protection where private financing is involved. This was, in a nutshell, the content of this new paper on how the World Bank orchestrated private investors and widened the scope of its mandate to revitalize itself. If you want to learn more about our study, please go to the Regulation and Governance website to download our article. As I mentioned earlier in this video, it's open access. If you want to know more about my research, please consult my website. And please do not hesitate to get in touch with us in case you might have any comments or questions. Thank you for watching. Take care and goodbye.